Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Over the next half an hour, we'll be looking beyond the business headlines by giving you in-depth perspective on the stories that are affecting all of us. Coming up on today's show, the UK and Nigeria have concluded trade and investment talks at the Economic and Development Forum in London. Both countries have pledged to increase support for small and medium-sized enterprises that are the engine behind the UK and Nigeria's £3 billion economic partnership. Channel's Business Global was granted access to the delegation and will be providing their reaction during the show. And the British government is facing its second legal challenge over controversial plans to send asylum seekers to Rwanda. Dr. Joseph Mullen, an academic development and immigration specialist at the Electronic Immigration Network, will be joining me from Sussex to provide some context to the fierce opposition of the multi-million-pound scheme. Then later, I'll be speaking with James Reid, a professor of economics at the University of Reading, about the corruption controversies surrounding the 2022 FIFA World Cup, which is to take place in Qatar in November. But first, let's have a look at the topic that is dominating headlines here in the UK. Allegations of sexism, misogyny and bullying at the heart of the British government. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said any minister found guilty of sexual harassment will be dismissed, following reports that 3 members of his cabinet are under investigation. The allegations range from making inappropriate comments to more serious wrongdoing. At least one complaint is believed to involve criminality.
Well, I think it's obviously unacceptable for anybody to be doing that kind of thing in the workplace. It would be the same for any kind of job up and down the country. Let's be absolutely clear about that. What needs to happen now is that the proper procedures need to be gone through. The independent complaints and grievances procedure needs to be activated, and we need to get to understand the facts. But yeah, I mean, this is clearly, that kind of behaviour is clearly totally unacceptable.
Earlier, I spoke with our business correspondent Simon Pusey for some analysis. Simon, local elections taking place next week. The Prime Minister would have wanted that to be the main topic of discussion during PMQs. But yet again, there is more scandal, but this time it's quite sinister.
Yeah, so I think this is relating to misogyny within the Houses of Parliament, and you're right, in Prime Minister's questions and in Parliament generally, the Conservatives and Boris Johnson have been keen to talk about local elections and various local councils and how cheap council tax is in Conservative boroughs and how expensive it is in Labour, and saying that this is why people should vote Conservative, so they're trying to keep this on this. Obviously, Boris Johnson's got his own problems in a myriad of different ways, and Ukraine is dominating, but this is something that seems to be coming to the fore at the moment. And it's after a couple of events in the last few days, really. A male member of Parliament on the Conservative benches, on the front benches, looking at inappropriate material on his phone during the House of Commons session, which is absolutely extraordinary given the amount of cameras there, given the amount of people that are there watching. Exactly. And so that's being looked into officially. The Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, going on TV today to talk about Ukraine and to talk about the UK's actions in Ukraine, but being forced to answer questions about whether female MPs are facing sexism and harassment in the House of Commons. He said that a culture of long hours and drinking can create a toxic mix. And there's other things. There's Angela Rayner, a newspaper article about her supposedly...
She's the deputy.
Exactly, supposedly using her legs to try and put off Boris Johnson. Again, that's been condemned by Boris Johnson himself as tosh and, sexism. But there's this culture, and especially it's a male-dominated chamber, even though it's getting better. But this seems to be more and more... On both sides of the House, Labour too, a Labour MP saying that a shadow minister had told her that men were going after her in a sexist way. So I think this is just more and more stories will come out, because it is quite a closed off thing and it is a traditional place. Obviously the House of Commons, there's a lot of tradition there, but with that probably comes historic things that should not have happened, and it obviously needs to change, and there needs to be some kind of revolution there. So I think there's something that we'll continue to see, and we'll continue to unfortunately see more examples. But I think most people saying that the Speaker of the House of Commons is dealing with this in the right way. Lindsay Hoyle, obviously, Sir Lindsay Hoyle recently promoted to that job, and that he is taking it seriously. But there's just so many cases of bullying or harassment or alleged harassment, and I think we will see more of this come out, and it's not going to be easy for Boris Johnson to divert attention, which he wants to do, to the local elections.
How do you think the local elections will pan out? We were just saying off air that Sir Keir Starmer, who some people described as boring during the whole pandemic, is pretty firm at the moment.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how it goes, because obviously it'll be a test of Boris Johnson's popularity. He's obviously been under pressure for a long time over things, but a lot of people say this is the Westminster bubble, this is kind of the Twitter sphere, and people who are interested in politics, it's going to be interesting to see actually how people go out and vote.
They care about the cost of living, don't they?
They do, and that's a huge crisis at the moment. People would say that he's done well on Ukraine, but do people, really care when it comes to the ballot box about Boris Johnson's actions in Ukraine when it's so far away? So it'll be interesting to see what, that whole scandal of Partygate, will that affect him? And as you say, Sir Keir Starmer seems to be doing pretty well in terms of the cost of living and holding the government to account on things like Partygate. It's interesting to see exactly which way that will fall. And it'll obviously, looking ahead to a general election, it'll be really interesting to see how local elections go.
Absolutely. We'll talk about that next week. Thanks, Simon. The UK and Nigeria held trade and investment talks at the Economic and Development Forum in London earlier this week to promote trade as a force for good and boost a partnership worth over £3 billion. At the gathering, both countries marked increased support for small and medium-sized enterprises in Nigeria, including the UK Manufacturing Africa programme, which has helped 12 firms in Nigeria secure foreign investment.
Well, MC12 will be held, I believe, in June. We're looking forward to participating in that. It will be the first ministerial conference since the assumption of office of Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. We believe that her presence there is doing a lot to improve the image of Nigeria, because she is doing a lot in improving the processes in the WTO. There have been a lot of problems, a lot of, I'm sure before, you're aware that before her appointment that the WTO was in crisis, and since her appointment she's done a lot to resolve many of the problems that existed, and I believe that is a testament to the fact that Nigerians, wherever they are, especially on the international scene, always do well.
Separately, Femi Gbajabiamila, Speaker of the Nigeria House of Representatives, held a meeting with the Speaker of the UK's House of Commons, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, to explore possible collaborations between the two nations in the area of insecurity, parliamentary diplomacy, political and economic prosperity. Earlier in the week, his delegation made a courtesy call to the Nigeria High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, Ambassador Sharafa Tunji Ishola. The British government is facing its second legal challenge over controversial plans to send asylum seekers to Rwanda. The multi-million-pound deal will see asylum seekers who arrive in the UK in lorries or by small boats across the Channel placed on one-way flights to the East African country, where they'll be given an opportunity to start a new life. Dr. Joseph Mullen, an academic development and immigration specialist at the Electronic Immigration Network, joins me now from Sussex for more on this. Dr. Joseph Mullen, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global today. Now, earlier this week, the government were facing a second legal challenge over this highly controversial plan to send migrants to Rwanda. I think most people, even if they don't agree with the sentiment, can understand the moral and ethical backlash, which has been led by, of course, the Archbishop of Canterbury. But in terms of the legal concerns, how can opposition voices tackle the government on this?
Yes. This week there has been a second legal challenge. And the legal challenge is quite significant in that it comes from the very people who are intended to implement the measures of transporting the migrants from the UK to Rwanda. And that is the Public Services Union, who find it objectionable under international law to implement this policy.
Right. Now, the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, has insisted, and I did actually hear Prime Minister Boris Johnson at the dispatch box this week during Prime Minister's questions also insist that the Labour Party, as well as campaign groups, have no viable option. We know there are issues. It's a very small island, Britain. How are we going to prevent deaths in the English Channel? What are the workable solutions?
Yes, the question of deaths in the English Channel and of human traffickers is put to the fore very much by the government. But this is a secondary issue for the government. The real objective is to deter asylum seekers from arriving in Britain with the threat that they would be deported to Rwanda. Now, the question is quite valid. How do you reduce the flow of migrants to the UK? It is not a question of reduction. It is a question of respecting human rights under the Refugee Convention. And already there are mechanisms in place in the UK to legally allow migrants to come to the island, but in the context of the shifting from a state of asylum to a state of refugeedom. And this is what the Rwanda issue is all about.
Social media, well, particularly African social media, African diaspora social media, is abuzz with many conspiracy theories and valid positions as to why Britain, Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the Home Secretary have selected Rwanda. Given your significant experience within the migration field, why was Rwanda the chosen option, given its pretty barbaric record of human rights abuses?
The choice of selection of Rwanda, in this instance, it actually is, to a degree, a mutual convenience. We must see it from the Rwandese point of view also. All the emphasis in the UK news coverage has been on the UK's interest in Rwanda. What we have not looked at is the Rwandese interest in hosting refugees. And this fits in, if you read the Rwandese papers, for example, from yesterday, the New Times, where President Kagame has outlined his role. He sees it in a Pan-African context. He is following up his leadership of the African Union of 2 years ago with the upcoming Commonwealth Heads of State meeting, the CHOGM meeting, which will take place in mid-June in Kigali in Rwanda. So he sees himself as being able to bridge the culture, so to speak, and also to enhance his standing within the donor community. Now, this is important insofar as the economic growth of Rwanda has been approximately 7% over the last 10 years, outstanding in African terms. When you compare it to Burundi, which is a country which mirrors similar characteristics to Rwanda, their per capita income is in the 700s, whereas that in Rwanda is in the 2000s.
Dr. Joseph Mullen, academic development and immigration specialist at the Electronic Immigration Network. Thank you so much for joining me. Emmanuel Macron won a resounding victory against Marine Le Pen in the French presidential elections last weekend, but with more than 13 million people abstaining from the ballot, the results have exposed the crumbling centre for traditional parties in France. For more analysis on the results, I'm now being joined by Paolo Kiyoketi, a political scientist at the European University Institute. Dr. Paolo joins me from Innsbruck in Austria. Dr. Paolo Kiyoketi, thank you so much for joining me on Channels Business Global again. Firstly, your assessment of these results.
Well, thank you, Juliana. Well, Macron won the second round of the election comfortably with 58.5% of the votes against 41.5% for Le Pen. His score was much lower than 5 years ago when he won 66.1% of the vote, but higher than the expectation of most pollsters and observers, myself included. For this, he must thank a weakened but still effective Republican front, where center-right and far-left voters tend to turn out for him to defeat Madame Le Pen, despite their actual rejection of Macron's own ideas.
Absolutely. I've got to say, it was quite uneventful in terms of the campaign period. Perhaps, obviously, if you're an observer not on the ground, you may see it differently. And just a few thousand miles away, you know, Europe is embroiled in a huge global-facing war. But there have been protests, and we know that the French do like to demonstrate. Some of them have been quite violent across pockets of the country. Why is France so divided?
Well, we must say that this year's demonstration against both Macron and Le Pen were very small and not comparable with the mass mobilizations against the far right, which took place, for example, in 2002 or 2017. Nevertheless, the widespread dissatisfaction toward a winning candidate is, of course, surprising for external observers, but it's quite logical in France and is due to the workings of the French electoral system, where voters are forced to vote for the lesser evil in the second round rather than for a preferred candidate. And in the current tripolar pattern of competition in France, this means that Macron can often succeed in winning large parliamentary majorities, or in this case, the presidential election, although only 25 to 40% of voters actually support his own ideas and program, and more than half of the voters support radical left or radical right candidates.
Okay, moving outside of France, since Merkel left office, there is a vacant position for a European leader. And we know that Macron is very pro-Europe. Do you think his historic re-election is going to solidify that position for him?
Well, Juliana, first we have to wait for the results of the upcoming parliamentary elections, which will take place on the 12th and 19th of June, where Macron is widely expected to win, but opposition parties are trying to deny him a full majority. That said, over the next 5 years, Macron will be much freer to lead the country as he sees fit, because he's barred from running again for re-election in 5 years. And he is very likely to pursue an even more proactive role in European and international affairs, working with Germany and other partners to strengthen the process of European integration and move toward a more united and powerful European Union.
Well, we'll just have to wait and see. And yes, we will be keeping our eyes out on that parliamentary setup. Thank you so much, Dr. Paolo Kiyoketi, a political scientist. Always a pleasure speaking with you on Channels Business Global. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliana. Bye.
Now to our final topic. In just a few months' time, one of the world's largest sporting tournaments will be taking place in Qatar. The road to the 2022 FIFA World Cup has faced severe criticism over human rights abuses and corruption, which is likely to cast a shadow over events. In the wake of the scandal involving Roman Abramovich, his links to the Kremlin and his removal as owner of Chelsea Football Club, observers are asking what more can be done to ensure standards are transparent in the multi-billion-dollar game. James Reid, a professor of economics at the University of Reading, joins me now for more on this. Professor James Reid, thank you so much for joining me on Channels Business Global. Football fans will know that Qatar is just a couple of months away now, and you'd forget that there was so much controversy surrounding the successful bid of Qatar, because, of course, that's been overshadowed by the pretty shocking removal of Roman Abramovich as head of Chelsea. Do you think this increased attention very recently over the Saudis, over Russia and football is going to propel the issues surrounding Qatar?
I think it will do. I think it may have changed the focus a little bit, but it's worth seeing what the links are between these different events. They're all to do with football's attempts to reach out to new areas, to new markets. And perhaps we've forgotten the fact that Russia was the previous host of the last World Cup, Qatar the host of the coming World Cup, and the bidding process for both of those World Cups was heavily criticised at the time when apparently better placed countries were denied. Now, there's a clear attempt, of course, by the footballing and many sporting bodies to go to new places, to expand to new markets. And sport provides a fantastic means for people to come together and get to know each other and overcome barriers, racial barriers and other kinds of nationalistic barriers. And so there's lots of potential for sport to make sport and not war. But the problem then comes when the sporting bodies begin to excuse some of the things that are going on.
Absolutely, here. It's really interesting that you mentioned racial issues, because aside from corruption, we know that the beautiful game has some ugly issues. Even domestically here in the UK, we still struggle with racism on the pitch, don't we? But then there are also other issues, such as human rights abuses, such as rights for LGBTQ plus fans. And going back to Qatar, I was reading in the Times just yesterday that apparently since 2010, since the beginning of the construction of some of these sites, 6,500 migrants have died working. Now, of course, we know the Qataris absolutely refute that figure, but certainly we know migrants have died. And I know that Harry Kane, the English captain, and the rest of the team will be showing some sort of solidarity to those victims. Do you think this is likely going to cast a dark shadow in November?
I don't see how it can't, to be perfectly honest. The only real question is whether the steps taken are strong enough. The England team has a lot of potential to make very strong statements, by not even turning up, for example. But of course, that's an incredibly strong statement that I think is unlikely to happen. And that gives you an idea of the tension involved, because of course, national teams like England, like Germany, Spain, want to compete at this world stage, the biggest world stage. And in many respects, FIFA has left these national teams, national football associations, many of whom, like the FA, have got very laudable campaigns over many, many years now to tackle aspects of abuse of racial minorities and other protected characteristics. And so all of these football associations are put in a very difficult place by FIFA organising a World Cup, that pinnacle of the footballing globe, in a place where there are such repressive rules and practices in place. I mean, the fact that they'll be relaxed for a while when the World Cup takes place, I mean, that shouldn't be that shouldn't be okay from FIFA's perspective. These are things, rules and practices that are in place that just simply shouldn't be in place if this is a place where we're making sport and not war and not divisions.
Professor, before I let you go, I want to bring it back to the English game. Of course, I believe that's where the game was begun, created. Do you think what happened at Stamford Bridge is the reckoning? Because again, lots of talks about Newcastle and the Saudis, fans just feeling like they completely have no control over who's running it. There were huge issues, weren't they, with the Americans that owned Manchester United, which I believe is ongoing. Are we going to see a shift in governance?
I think it's hard, again, to imagine that there won't be some kind of change. Now, I think the level of international ownership in the Premier League is a good thing, because it breaks down those kinds of nationalistic barriers that there may be. Only British owners can be good for British clubs, that kind of thing. Football clubs are community organisations, social bodies, and perhaps new ownership structures, fan ownership, can come around as a result of this potentially. But yes, I definitely see a reckoning.
Thank you. A very pertinent point there, Professor James Reid, Professor of Economics at the University of Reading. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, sadly, that's all we have time for today. But as always, do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channel's Business Global. Goodbye.